Hey, guys. Welcome to Building This Community.
This is your city business and policy development podcast. We're your hosts,
Luke Patrick
and Andrew Klump. Welcome to this week's episode of Building This Community. Our guest today is Keith Larson. Keith is a transplant to Louisville and is currently a bankruptcy attorney at Seiler Waterman. Keith, how are you?
I'm well, guys. How are you?
Not too bad.
Yeah, doing pretty well. Jumping right in on these questions, Keith, we know you're a bankruptcy attorney. You're involved with a couple different boards here in the city. Can you give us a little bit of your background in your own words?
Yeah, sure. And first of all, thanks a lot for having me on. I'm really looking forward to chatting today. But yeah, you nailed it. You know, I've focused most of my career on helping small businesses and family-run businesses reorganize and hopefully move from a place where they're struggling to one where they can thrive again one day. For the past 6 years here in Louisville, I've been a member of the Bankruptcy and Financial Restructuring Group at the law firm Seiler Waterman. We represent all types of parties that are in and around the small business community, and that would include the businesses themselves, banks, creditors, equity interest holders, bankruptcy trustees, and even entities that are looking to acquire troubled businesses. And just by way of brief background, before becoming a bankruptcy attorney, probably 10 years ago or so, I'm starting to feel old here, I worked in politics in D.C. On a few campaigns and on the Hill before I started out on this venture in the law. And yeah, as far as the boards are concerned, the two boards that I'm most involved in right now are the Louisville Forum and Shively Area Ministries. The Forum is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization, and it hosts debates on subjects that are important to Louisville and the surrounding community. Generally, on the second Wednesday of every month, we have some sort of a program where we invite panelists to discuss their views on different topics. And these debates or discussions can at times get a little animated, but it's always very respectful, which is one of the things that I like about it. It's a policy discussion without the food throwing that you might see on network television. But we host congressional candidate debates, gubernatorial debates. We had an attorney general debate, and then we have discussions on topics that really can run the gamut from politics, like I said, to even sports, the economy. And lately, we've been having a lot of discussions about public health, obviously, and racial injustice. And then, as far as Shively Area Ministries, like all the zip codes in Jefferson County, as I understand it, have their own ministries. Shively Area Ministries, or SAM, as I like to call it, they help individuals and families that are in poverty and crisis. That can be anything from access to a food pantry or helping to pay rent, to avoid eviction, paying utility bills. And as you might imagine, I spoke to the director yesterday, actually, and as you could probably guess, in light of the current economy and the recession, they're seeing a lot more people in need of their help. And unfortunately, they're seeing a lot of families come in that they haven't seen before, that usually or previously had some disposable income, but now because of what's going on in the economy, don't. But fortunately, Sam is a very, very financially blessed and has been able to meet all the needs of people requesting help. So, to the extent that anyone listens to this and, feels like they're teetering on the edge or knows someone who is, you should certainly contact a ministry or Sam or, don't be shy. We're all in this together. Those are two boards that I really relish in being involved with.
So Keith, you told us a little bit about the bankruptcy, and you're telling us more about your boards that you're involved with. But you're, as I alluded to earlier, and you did as well, you're a New York to DC to Iowa to Louisville. You're a transplant with a lot of different perspectives or a lot of different experiences in cities that I would say vary quite a bit. So you have a unique perspective. Why then did you choose both Louisville Forum and the Shively Area Ministries as causes that you wanted to be involved with?
Sure. Well, the Louisville Forum certainly satiates my appetite to be involved in policy discussions. And like I said, it's not about it's not like we're having these like crossfire debates where people are yelling and screaming at each other or demonizing each other. I think one of our best debates that we ever had was it was in fact 2 years ago, even though we're still talking about the topic, but it was over 2 years ago. We had a discussion about removing the Confederate statutes, and we had people on the stage that could not disagree more on the topic, but they did it in such a respectful way and understanding where the other person was coming from. And it got heated at times. I mean, that is an emotionally fraught topic for good reason. But it was done in a way where, how do we move forward as a society, as Louisville? How do we move forward as opposed to just, pointing fingers? I think the Louisville Forum is a great organization for that, if that interests anyone. And then, Shively Area Ministries, I mean, that's just, you can't, and they do such a phenomenal job there. They have an amazing staff. And, I'm humbled just as a board member to belong, just to say that I help contribute in some little way. But, you can't do better, I don't think, than belonging to an organization whose mission is to, help people in crisis.
And both of those are areas that you think Louisville has to have to be successful, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you've got food deserts. You've got areas where it's hard for people to get, what they need to get by sometimes. So, yeah, we all need to be pulling on the same side of the rope on that one.
Well, kind of approaching it from a different perspective, when you're doing work with bankruptcy, you're also kind of aiming to help people get out of trouble, and not maybe from a food equity perspective, but from a financial perspective. And obviously when people hear the term bankruptcy, they maybe don't understand it as well. It's not always thought of in the best light, but a lot of businesses end up maybe needing that service, and it can be a really beneficial thing in the right context. Can you maybe explain some of the misconceptions surrounding bankruptcy, some of the advantages or pitfalls?
Sure, and you nailed it. It really can be the right thing in the right context at the right time. Somehow I think some people think of filing bankruptcy as an admission of failure. Or on the other end of the spectrum, I think some people think that those who file bankruptcy are somehow trying to game the system to gain an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
I think nothing can be further from the truth. The founding fathers, even back then, recognized the importance of bankruptcy. They included it in the Constitution for a reason. Bankruptcies then and now and throughout history with businesses are usually caused by events outside the control of the businesses, things that they could have never predicted. And it could be to everyone's benefit that the business survives and weathers the storm. It's just, how do you get there? We see a lot of instances where a business faces an unexpected lawsuit, or maybe the consumer world is moving away from your product. Think about, brick and mortar stores are becoming obsolete due to online shopping, or how the world is slowly moving off of coal and fossil fuels for good reason. But those businesses, when they got into it, they couldn't have seen that coming. And now we have a global pandemic. It's forcing entire industries to shut down for months on end. There's no way they could have seen that coming. So the point is that businesses, there is this misconception about businesses that file but they don't typically file just because they're bad at business or they've mismanaged their money. It's usually to overcome some sort of an outside force over which they had no control.
No, absolutely. Now, when a company begins the process of declaring bankruptcy, are there any common pitfalls or mistakes that they might make or anything like that?
Yeah, I would say some of the bigger mistakes that people who run small businesses will make is, unfortunately, we see a lot of cases where a business will stop paying its taxes, like its withholding taxes or sales use taxes, because the IRS or the Kentucky Department of Revenue, they're not one of the creditors that comes knocking right away. They have to wait until returns are filed and paperwork is processed, so that can take a while. But the big problem with that is, like all debts, that those will come home to roost. But even more problematic is that the equity owners or the LLC members or whoever is owning the business is personally liable for those taxes. If the business goes under, guess what? Business owner, you have to pay those taxes. So that's a big mistake that we see a lot of people make is, if you're in trouble and you're having trouble paying your debts, go talk to an attorney or somebody who can help with that, but don't stop paying your taxes for a variety of reasons.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that could be catastrophic, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
But we've talked about the advantages and what you can get out of bankruptcy, how that can change, your circumstances for the better. What are some disadvantages? What do you see are the problems?
Some disadvantages of actually filing. It's expensive. Okay, and I'd like to talk later about some legislation that recently came down from Congress that makes it less expensive, but it can be very expensive. I talked to some of my colleagues around the office, and even a small Chapter 11 locally here that goes pretty smooth start to finish, easily could be $40,000 to $50,000 in attorney's fees, if not more. Hopefully that's going to change with the new legislation, but it can be expensive. Another downside is there is a potential loss of equity. There's this, I won't go into too much detail, but there's a thing in bankruptcy called the absolute priority rule, which basically says that if you have equity in a business, you really can't retain that equity unless you essentially infuse cash into the business to buy that equity back. So in order for it to be fair to your creditors, you need to infuse what they call new value into the business to buy that equity back, and then that cash infusion is used to pay off some of your usually unsecured creditors.
Well, and so you've talked about bankruptcy generally here, and I think you've in part answered the next question I'm going to ask, but what then are kind of unique bankruptcy laws maybe to Louisville, or what do Louisville area startups and businesses need to know?
Yeah, I think they're so in February 2020, somewhat fortuitously because it sort of hit right around the time that COVID hit, a new subchapter of bankruptcy law came into effect. It's called Subchapter 5 of Chapter 11. It was the Small Business Reorganization Act. And the purpose of this is to really streamline the process by which small businesses can reorganize and to eliminate the expenses and overhead that we talked about. Typically, a large bankruptcy filing could take years. Okay, it could take a big business years in bankruptcy. The debtor has 300 days, almost a year, to file its plan of reorganization. Well, this new subchapter 5 that was recently enacted by Congress says you've got to be in and out in 90 days. So that drastically decreases the expense. And there were some other things that Congress did. They got rid of what I was talking about before, the absolute priority rule. They got rid of that. They took away some of the fees that you have to pay the United States trustee program. So the idea was that a small business could benefit from from filing a Chapter 11 in a way that they haven't been able to up until recently. It's interesting though as far as Louisville is concerned, right? So it used to be like when this law went into effect in February, you would qualify as a small business for this subchapter 5 streamlined process if your debts did not exceed $2.75 million. Okay, but what the CARES Act did was it said, okay, we understand businesses are in trouble right now. We're going to increase that debt limit from 2.75 to 7.5 million. So under this new subchapter 5, you're still considered a small business if you have debts less than $7.5 million. And that's huge in Louisville because if you look at the data from 2019, okay, in 2019, 16 businesses filed Chapter 11 in Louisville, and all but one of them would have qualified for this new subchapter 5, meaning they had debts under $7.5 million. So basically, this new law is going to, I would think, encompass just about all, or 90% probably, of anyone who's looking to file a bankruptcy here in Louisville.
Wow. So you're saying at least some of these federal changes are really going to at least give these local businesses an opportunity to maybe have some sort of restructuring that wouldn't have had that opportunity previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my colleagues just wrapped one up. It was, I think it. I'll give Bill Harbison a plug. I think he consummated and got confirmed the first case in the country under this new subchapter 5. And man, he was in and out in under 90 days, and that's huge. Wow. That's huge for a business to get in, renegotiate its contracts, renegotiate its secured debts, put together a plan of reorganization, and move on with their lives in 30 days. 90 days. That's huge.
Well, how long is that compared to previously?
Well, like I said, normally the time frame is 300 days that a debtor has to file. So 10. What is that? 10 months. So, but the courts routinely give extensions to that 300-day period. So I've been involved in big Chapter 11 cases that go on for years, 3-4 years, and you're paying attorney's fees and U.S. trustee fees and court fees, and you're paying your creditors' fees over 3 years. I mean, that small businesses can't do that. But this new legislation wipes that all out. And like I said, you can be in and out in 90 days.
Wow, that's incredible. So to move on a little bit here, what do you think we have to talk about, right, the impact COVID has had on our city and state? And you've mentioned a little bit. Are there any other changes that people need to know about just purely because of COVID?
Yeah, no. So I think we were already starting to see an uptick in some struggling businesses pre-COVID. You had, retail was struggling, hospitals, the coal industry. We're 4 months into this pandemic now, and right now, I think businesses are still waiting to see if they can weather the storm or not. So we haven't, at least locally, and I think the data says nationally as well, we haven't really seen a huge uptick in bankruptcy filings because I think businesses are waiting, and they want to know how long is this going to last? Are we going to get a vaccine? Are the kids, are the kids going to go back to school? In which case, I can go back to work. Is
there anything that your industry is doing then to prepare for the coming potential wave of bankruptcies?
Well, we're trying to educate people on this Small Business Reorganization Act because it particularly locally here in Louisville, I think it will have a really big impact. But we're also talking to clients about the PPP money, because initially they were going to have, I think, 8 weeks to spend that, and now it's being kicked out to, basically the end of the year. But the other thing we're advising businesses on is, yes, there are short-term implications of COVID, but what are the long-term implications of COVID? You have these rents, or you have restaurants, you have event venues, movie theaters, hotels. They're going to be allowed to reopen, but are people going to come back? And if they do come back, even if Governor Beshear said we're going to open restaurants at 75% in 2 weeks, are people going to come back at that capacity? Same with retail. Are people going to go to malls? So I guess the question is, how long will customers stay away, and how do you prepare for that? And I guess you need to look at things like reducing your long-term expenses and overhead with the anticipation that you may not have the revenue to support it in the long term. And that is that's one of the things where I think bankruptcy can be very helpful, because you can, once you get in bankruptcy, you can renegotiate your contracts. You can even reject contracts if you have a lease on a building the building that's operating out of that establishment is not profitable. You can reject the lease. So sorry, go ahead.
No, you mentioned that PPP payments, coming from the federal government. How has that affected business and bankruptcy in your eyes? And do you think they've done enough to maybe stave off some of the worst of the potential negative economic outcomes?
Well, it's obviously helped, and we've seen that it's helped. And I think the other thing that helped was extending the amount of time that businesses have to spend the funds, instead of just limiting it to the 8 weeks, because businesses were starting to wonder, if I can't spend all that money in 8 weeks, do I have to start giving out bonuses, or what do I do? So I think that we have seen, and that's where I was saying before, I think a lot of businesses are waiting on the sidelines because or waiting to see what happens, because there's talk right now in Congress of another stimulus bill, and maybe that will have additional PPP money in there. So it definitely has changed things as far as we haven't seen a lot of bankruptcy filings, because I think entities are sort of waiting to see what it looks like when they run out of their PPP money. But then again, you also had a situation where landlords couldn't evict for a long time. So there really wasn't a huge incentive to pay rent, but eventually, that's changing now. And generally, if you can't pay your overhead, or you can't keep the lights on, that's one of the triggers for, does it make sense to keep this business going or not?
Well, no, there's definitely some question marks looming on the horizon.
Well, and I think part of it is that ultimately this is just a guessing game for everyone right now. I mean, you're alluding to a lot of the major factors that are going to play into it, but ultimately, right, we just don't know where everything's going to go at this point. And with that said, do you think there's anything else that people need to know about bankruptcy law? I mean, we're wrapping up here, but is there anything else that you think people should know about bankruptcy?
Well, I think it's a great tool to first hit pause on the chaos. So if your business is struggling, it's chaos, and your people are coming at you from all different directions. All your creditors are coming at you from different venues. So it puts pause on that, because your creditors can no longer take action against you to collect once you're in bankruptcy, and it gives you a chance to take a breath and think about, can this business survive, and if it can, what is that going to look like? And then from there, you can, like I said before, one of the real assets of a bankruptcy is renegotiating contracts that might have made sense at the time you entered into them, but no longer do. So you can renegotiate those leases. You can renegotiate your bank notes with lower interest rates and longer terms, to make it more viable to make the payments. So I think that initial breathing spell, which we call the bankruptcy automatic stay, and then, renegotiating contracts, renegotiating secured debt. I think those are some of the bigger advantages to being in a bankruptcy. And it sort of stops the chaos, like I said.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure when people first reach out to you, they're probably feeling really overwhelmed, and just being able to kind of quiet all the noise and walk them through it. I'm sure that's a phenomenal benefit for them. But Keith, before we wrap up, I got one last final question we like to ask to all of our guests. If you had the power to change one policy in Louisville, what would it be?
I guess it's not really relevant to what we've been talking about today, but
that's absolutely acceptable.
Yeah.
But it is a hot topic right now. We have got to make it easy, or as easy as possible, for people to vote in Kentucky. I think, you think about John Lewis, and he certainly would have loved the fact that people were willing to wait in line for 2 hours to vote, but they shouldn't have to. We really need to take a hard look at this permanent, no excuse mail-in voting. I think I saw that Kentucky is one of only 8 other states that requires an excuse over and above the fact that there's a worldwide pandemic going on to vote by mail. But look at the numbers. I think over 1 million Kentuckians voted in this June primary, which was a record, and 70% of those were absentee. And I haven't heard any credible allegations of fraud. I mean, it's thrown out there, but I haven't heard anybody bringing it up. But with COVID, if the pandemic, the governor's saying the pandemic is more dangerous today than it was in June, and it might be more dangerous in November than it is now. I don't understand how you have people show up at the polls.
Well, I think ultimately,
sorry, go ahead.
Part of the issue is, right, that they're worried about getting too much of an influx of mail-in votes, that it overwhelms the system. But with that said, I do think that something that's really important, and this occurred in the primaries, was that some counties would call you and try and help, rectify maybe some discrepancy in your mail-in ballot if there was a mistake, versus other counties in Kentucky just didn't have that. And so the ballot would just be invalidated. So I think what you're talking about is really important, but there are also issues and hurdles that have to be overcome to make sure that that's possible.
Well, I'm for jumping the hurdles. Yeah. I'm with you 100%. I think,
yeah. Well, and I know the thrust of your podcast is, you guys talk a lot about small businesses in Louisville, and if anyone is out there as an entrepreneur, I don't know if this has been done yet or not, but we've got to figure out a way to get people to vote on their phones. I mean, think about, like, in order to get into my phone, it needs my thumbprint. It needs to recognize my face. That to me is much more secure than just going up to a polling place with a number 2 pencil and my photo ID. So anyway, I just think going back to the original point, we need to make it as easy as possible for Kentuckians to vote, and whatever that looks like could vary in some people's minds, but we can't, as a country, hold ourselves out as this like beacon of democracy if we say you can vote between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. On one day, a work day.
Yeah, a work day nonetheless.
And if you have a job or if you have kids and you can't get there, tough luck. I mean, that just, I don't know. That doesn't sit well with me.
Well, absolutely, Keith. And I thank you so much for talking to us. It was a real pleasure.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
Take care, Keith.
We'll pick back up with our reaction segment after a word from our sponsor.
Well, Luke, that was another great interview, as always. Today's interview was a little bit different, I think, than a lot of the ones that we've done in the past, in that this interview seemed to be more of an education rather than just a policy proposal. But with that said, I think it provided a lot of important information for businesses and startups. Luke, did you have any first thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you're right. I don't think bankruptcy is like a very well understood subject to begin with. I mean, most law schools don't require it. You know, it's on the curriculum, but it's kind of an elective thing. And I never took it. I definitely came up against bankruptcy laws. I had to study them for papers I wrote. But like general broad topics in bankruptcy, I don't have as foundational understanding as I'd like to. And, it really does seem to be a beneficial thing to have a grasp on. The biggest takeaway, I think, really, when you're first getting into bankruptcy law is it reshapes your understanding of it. It's just not as negative a process, not a bad thing, like you might conceptualize of it beforehand.
But I thought that was the fair assessment that Keith gave, was both the positives and the negatives. I mean, the cost is, to me, seems like a true barrier to people actually going through it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I was pretty surprised by the cost as well. It would definitely limit the type of business that would be able to employ a bankruptcy attorney. But
were you surprised by the number?
Yeah, it seemed much lower than I expected. And, it could be a result of people just not understanding like the tools they have at their disposal, not knowing that's a viable route to pursue, or it might be the cost, being a prohibitive thing.
Well, and I think that's the thing that ultimately becomes a business decision and not a policy, is that, and I don't know the answer to this, but that businesses and startups, if they're looking at it and they're teetering on the edge, I think what this conversation shows is that those people should reach out to a bankruptcy attorney and see what steps they can take. But making the decision as to whether or not they want to pull the trigger has to come down to a business decision, because you don't want these people that are these businesses to have the owners put so much capital into their bankruptcy filing to restructure their startup or their business, and then not have any funds left over for a new business, a new entity afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, most attorneys are willing to give you a consultation for free just to see, assess the claims you have. And I think it's more than worth your while to at least try and engage someone just to see if it fits your business. If you come upon like a period of insolvency or you're facing that down the line.
But it does seem like they're making it a little more accessible with, the changing of the policies, with it being now 90 days as opposed to 300 days for filings. And
that seems like an incredibly expedited procedure. Like I was really shocked that the idea of getting a bankruptcy resolved in 90 days seems
incredible, right?
Yeah, really impressive.
But it's still that figure that seems to be the thing that limits accessibility the most. Yeah. But I am glad that they're taking steps to make it more accessible.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I don't want to change gears too hard here, but whenever I think about bankruptcy, I'm kind of forced to think about the current. It's not a corporate insolvency, but the current state of our state's finances and our city's finances. And that kind of leads me into the paper I was working on this week. It was Default Without Capital Accounts, the Economics of Municipal Bankruptcy. And municipal bankruptcies are a chapter filed under Chapter 9 bankruptcies, also known as municipal bankruptcies. They're honestly a pretty rare event. Like the most prominent example would probably be Detroit in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. You've also had Birmingham, Alabama, the county. I think it's Jefferson.
Yeah, it is Jefferson County. No relation.
Yeah, no relation to Jefferson County, Kentucky, but it's Jefferson County, Alabama actually declared bankruptcy, had to a few years ago. Also, I think as a result of the financial crisis.
Well, in that paper, essentially what they referenced, right, was the governments there basically made some long-term investments with more rosy or happy projected futures, and they just got caught.
Well,
and they were both mostly infrastructure projects, I believe.
Exactly. And I mean, like, that's the kind of thing you assume governments are going to spend on. It's the kind of thing that people want governments to spend on.
Mm-hmm.
But not every proposed project is a good idea fiscally. And governments, politicians in particular, like to make promises.
Mm-hmm.
And that might not be, the promises they make in the heat of a campaign might not actually pan out in the best interest of their constituents in the long run. And when you come upon tough financial times, when you're running deficits year after year after year, there comes a point when the bill comes due and you're faced with a real creditor issue. You're either going to have to keep basically issuing bonds, but the quality of your bonds, the credit rating on your bonds at the municipal level is just going to drop, and then you're not going to get the return you need.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're going to have to start cutting, spending, austerity measures, and nobody likes that.
Or raising taxes.
There's the third one. Yeah, exactly.
So I think ultimately what this paper that you're talking about shows is that and this is kind of my personal takeaway, I'm not sure there's necessarily the point of the article, is that when you're taking these steps, that they're basically saying not to take risks that large from a municipal perspective, because you're not a corporation. It's harder to move funds around, that it's really advising to live within your means as a government.
Yeah.
But for me, if you do take those risks, if you do get loans, it should be, then these cities should be looking to extend the length of their loan to give them more flexibility. So, for example, in the white paper cities that you were talking about, they got too close into their, short-term payments and the need for other projects that were piling up, that they ultimately felt like they had to file for municipal bankruptcy. But when you are a city that decides to take out a loan, which I'm not completely against, but I am adverse to it in a lot of situations, because I think cities should be living more within their means. But if cities decide to take it, they should be looking at it for a longer period of time, maybe 2/3 to double the length, because there are so many issues that come up when taking out loans. So, for example, transitions of power. In Louisville, for example, there were so many council people that when they came into office this past term that said, they were completely unaware of the pending bubble pension crisis that was going to affect the city of Louisville. So you can kind of eliminate that excuse at least a little bit, as far as the loan aspect of it, if you have a more elongated period of time to pay off your loan. And then the goal should still be to pay that off in the same window. So if you're saying that you want to pay this loan off in 5 years, but the city's getting a loan for 10, the goal should still be that 5-year period. And maybe you have a resolution or something that commemorates that. But I think, at least in the white paper areas, those cities are really playing too close to the line, and refinancing and other things like that can be very, very difficult. And these cities just have to give themselves room for cost overrun for the worst case scenario.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty common knowledge that cost overruns in government projects are endemic, that they're just a part of the system.
Mm-hmm.
It's a necessary feature of democracy, that you're going to want to run deficits to spend on the projects that the people need in the long term. And you run into problems when you don't address those deficits after a long enough period of time. And that's the issue that cities, states all across the nation are starting to face now. I mean, Illinois and Kentucky are leading the nation right now in like our deficits, and it's insane.
Do you think Kentucky's gonna file? Or municipalities within Kentucky? I
think the more likely scenario is that municipalities within Kentucky file before the state. I think if it becomes a statewide financial crisis to the point where bankruptcy is legitimately on the table, I believe it would force the federal government's hand to inject money in to come with some kind of top-down bailout.
Well, Kentucky has some sort of constitutional limitations as well.
Yeah, there are definitely limitations at the state level. And it's not just Kentucky. A lot of states have that baked into their constitution.
But it just depends. Like some states don't, some states do.
Yeah. And I couldn't offer you an exhaustive list off the top of my head of the ones that do and don't, but I know, another thing that's proposed constantly, people talk about constantly, at least for federal government reform, is balanced budget amendments. Mm-hmm. The issue is almost every state, I believe 49 states have a balanced budget amendment. Most in their constitution. Kentucky does. And that hasn't really constrained our spending in any meaningful way.
Well, if you're just taking alternatives and taking loans out and issuing bonds and doing all the alternatives, you're still going to have a balanced budget. You're just not spending over.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, It's two sides to the same coin.
Yeah. And it's a really disturbing situation to be in. I worry about the long-term health of a lot of states that are finding themselves in these positions right now. And I worry that what's going to happen is they're going to do their best to try and push pension obligations and major expenditures onto the cities, which cities have a better track record for managing their budgets than states, but it's still not, it's not phenomenal.
Yeah.
And they're either going to force municipal bankruptcies and try and resolve some of their debt that way, or they're going to push themselves to the financial limit and wait for a federal bailout. And it's neither one's a good situation.
Do you think any of that is like a almost trickle down effect? I know that's almost like a trigger word of trickle down economics, but do you think the fact that the federal government continues to spend over its budget creates this ecosystem where everyone has a higher standard of what they expect from their government? So then the states are then kind of forced to provide more.
I mean, you'd like to see leadership from the top, of course. It'd be nice to see like a more well-managed budget from the federal government, but good leadership can come, anywhere along the chain. It just takes people with a competent understanding of a balance sheet and how to run and manage an account, to step up and say, we really can't afford this project, or I think we do need to raise taxes.
Well, I guess my point was that the standard of living associated with what the federal government provides is that providing I kind of am seeing it as it's putting more pressure on state governments to provide more means as well. That's outside maybe like the tax district, the tax bracket that we're currently in. So it's either, if you're going to balance the budget from the federal level, I know we're getting outside the bankruptcy stuff here, but if you're going to balance the budget, you either have to cut spending or raise taxes. And we're really kind of stuck in this medium that the states then have to make that decision as well. Yeah.
It's a tough situation, especially when Kentucky has, so many, has a huge poverty rate relative to other states. We have pockets of wealth, but in general, we're losing, industry. Coal is dying. We've got all kinds of problems, and it's tough to jack up tax rates when a lot of people are experiencing, poverty, and it won't do as much when you don't have the broad base of income earners that are going to be able to sustain like a long-term tax increase regime.
Agreed. So ultimately, getting back to the root of the question before we went on this rant, do you think Kentucky files bankruptcy? I think you had the very political answer of not answering the question.
I can't. I think it would be really surprising if Kentucky actually files. I think we're going to get right to that point. Mm-hmm. But before the decision comes down, I think we'll probably get intervention from up top. I think the federal
you think it's that dire?
If we don't address our pension system in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we'll probably be facing some serious consequences.
And the unemployment issue that we're facing right now. But we might get additional relief just from the federal government because of COVID. But I think that is really putting more pressure on us. But hopefully that means that other things will be legalized, like medical marijuana and, gambling. I mean, those things that could produce, even if they don't produce enough to cover the deficit, at least it's providing something that's inching us closer. So I think they're going to be really hard out looking for new sources of revenue, and I think they're going to have to do that. Look into those.
No, absolutely.
Okay, so we've kind of beaten the bankruptcy stuff to death a little bit. Unless you have any final thoughts on that part.
No.
Okay.
I'm down to move on.
So, what did you think? I'm always very interested too in the boards that people are on, because I think it really reflects on what they value and also what they see as needs for the community.
Yeah. I mean, you've only got so much time in the day. What you choose to spend your time on, it's a reflection of who you are. Yeah. Yeah.
And so Keith is doing the Louisville Forum. I know he's a little bit of a political junkie too, but ultimately that's kind of what we do, right? With this podcast it is a policy junkie's dream.
Yeah.
And
trying to dive into the weeds.
Yeah. They dive into the weeds. They provide good informational sessions, and they do it all with good cadence.
You've had the opportunity to actually attend a few of these.
Yeah. Oh, I only went to one, and that was on the insurance business tax, and they had multiple Metro Council members there, and they were even there to talk to people before and after. So you could, I could go up and talk to a couple of them, and it was a very interesting session.
Yeah, I'm sure. No, I wish I'd gotten to see the debate over the Confederate monuments. I wonder if that would play out the same way in today's climate.
Probably not. I would assume not.
I assume not. And
I also really enjoyed hearing about what he was doing with the Shively area ministries, because those types of things, food deserts have always kind of been a key topic for me, and I think ultimately we have to take more steps to alleviate those issues. And his work with them obviously goes beyond just food deserts and just caring about the community. But it's really important to have those safety nets and those aids in the community, whether private or public.
No, I absolutely. I think it's one of those things that can easily go overlooked, especially if people aren't themselves very engaged in that type of work. But I think you'd be very surprised at the actual amount of good that some of those organizations can do in the community in terms of affecting positive change.
Fair enough. And the last thing that he said that I thought was another great talking point, I think we could probably go for hours on this too, was the voting.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that they need to find ways to expand voting. And I think what we had in the last primary was great.
Yeah. I think it came as a surprise to me when I had to write a little bit about the right to vote somewhere along the line in law school. But there actually isn't a constitutional guarantee of a right to vote. It's not. I mean, you can look and look; it's not there. So it's something that's reserved for the states, and so that's something that. Because it's a state level function and not a federal function, you're able to affect change in that kind of policy area, I think, more directly. And so it only benefits people to get involved in. If you care about expanding the right to vote, making sure that everybody actually has access to the ballot, then you need to write your state legislator. You need to get involved, because I think the idea of no excuse mail-in voting it's uncontroversial in my eyes. That needs to happen.
There's no excuse for it to not happen.
Yeah, there's no excuse for it to not happen. Exactly. It's just I don't know, especially in times like this when we got a pandemic raging, to try and restrict it to an in-person vote is or somewhat restricted is
agreed. But I will say this though, and this might be my computer science degree haunting me, but I don't see any time soon where we have computerized voting whatsoever. I know he was just giving his opinion, but I just don't. I see mail-in ballots. I see paper ballots. I just think digitalized voting is just so insanely easy to be hacked and have legitimate issues.
That worry is definitely pervasive, I think, in the dialogue around voting rights.
But I don't think there's really mail-in fraud.
No, not to the degree
that
it's talked about. Yeah. It's covered in the media. It's an almost infinitesimally small percentage of issues are intentional voting fraud.
But with that said, they need to make sure that they have enough people working to count the votes.
Yeah.
And they also need to make sure that they have people on call to interact with people that mailed in ahead of time and ensure that those people, if they had issues with their mail-in ballot, it gets resolved. But the one thing I will say that is counter to this whole conversation is what happens when you have the mail-in ballots open for so long and you get the actual polling places open for a week and a half or 2 weeks. I actually like the walk-in availability for
the early
week.
Voting.
Yeah, but in the primary we had walk-in at one polling place, everyone knew where it was, versus having to go to your government center and do an absentee ballot in person.
Yeah,
I like it being a more common space, just being it set up just for that purpose and not mixing with the myriad of other government buildings.
Yeah, I get that.
And so I guess my point is I think that is a better scenario than doing the mail-in, because I think people oftentimes change their mind, or could, because the campaign's not over. But if you're mailing in your vote a month in advance, that can really affect the outcome of a campaign or of an election.
Yeah.
But if you're just doing a 1 week, you can go in anytime. I think that just makes it more flexible. That to me should be the bigger thing emphasized, is having more polling places open for multiple days rather than just one sole election day. But mail-in ballots still should be important. It's just that if you have it for too long of a window, then it can really impact.
Yeah, it could cause some confusion. It's not as much of a fear for me. I think I'd like to see the access to mail-in ballots expanded. I'd like to see the ID requirements that Kentucky has.
Yeah, those don't make any sense.
They don't really make any sense, and it doesn't. The study after study proves it's not really doing anything to decrease the amount of fraud. And fraud in the system is intentional fraud is just not. It's a non-issue. It really is.
You can barely get people to vote. I mean, how many people are going to commit fraud when you can barely get anybody to the polls?
I mean, the most common issue is actually people that would mail in and then forget that they mailed in. So this kind of fits into your argument of having it spaced out so much from the actual election day. If you're able to mail your ballot in a month in advance, you might genuinely forget that it's in the mail, and then you go turn up to vote, and then you just committed a federal crime. Yeah.
Or change your mind on who you wanted to vote for.
Yeah.
So that, I think, and again, I think we've exhausted this discussion, but I think we both agree that it needs to be expanded, but maybe we might disagree a little bit in the means as to how they do it.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. It's just, I really feel that, like, if you want a healthy, functioning democracy, as many people in that population need to be engaged in the political process, and any limit or any attempt to limit access, even if it's under the guise of protecting the election, that's undemocratic, and I think it's really it's unpatriotic.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I think we hit every topic that Keith talked about today. So as always, this was great.
Yeah, had a good time, Andrew.
Take it easy.
As always, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us on Building This Community. If you'd like any more information, you can follow us on Twitter at BuildingThisCom, COM, or you can follow Andrew
at Andrew J. Klump. And you can also follow Luke
at LMP43. Definitely subscribe, and we look forward to talking to you guys next week.